It was in this home that Abigail and her sisters and brother were raised. And so she was born here, raised here, educated here, learned how to run a household, and eventually was married from the parlor. She and John were wed from here. I think Abigail had a really unique mind, and she was curious and creative, and she was smart. It was from Weymouth that Abigail began corresponding with John when they began courting one another. And we have some of the early letters that they wrote, what we call the courtship letters. It's because of that correspondence that we know so much about our early American history, about the American Revolution, what some of the ideas and ideals were that were leading up to that time. But I think in looking back, it says a lot about how this home, Weymouth, and the church here formed Abigail.
My dad, Ed, back in the 90s, got a group of business people together, business leaders in Quincy, and they started a group called the Quincy Partnership. Their whole idea was to highlight all of this hidden history that was in Quincy. So one of the things they did is they commissioned statues from the sculptor Lloyd Lilly, and one of the statues was John Adams, and then the other statue was Abigail Adams, and she had her hand on her son John Quincy Adams. The way that my brother and I were raised, you always have to give back to the community that you're a part of. And from my parents' perspective, it always was trying to find ways to highlight what's great about the community and to do something that makes a lasting difference. So maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, when I was getting involved with the Weymouth Chamber of Commerce and I was looking around Weymouth, I noticed that there really wasn't much there to really celebrate Abigail Adams. So I had this kind of fantasy in my head that I would love to see an Abigail Adams statue in the town of Weymouth because that's where she was born, and I just felt like it needed to be there.
He was a really fun guy. He was the life of the party. He played piano, and he had played it professionally at one point when he was younger, and then art, became his love.
One day I just decided to reach out to Lloyd Lilly's family, and I asked them, did they keep the molds to Abigail Adams that made the original statue in Quincy? And luckily they did.
We had started talking about it months ahead of time, and he had various iterations of Abigail, some seated, some standing, and so forth. And he ended up wanting the standing pose. Abigail's left hand initially was on the shoulder of John Quincy Adams. And since John Quincy Adams was not going to be part of this sculpture, we had to decide what to do with that hand. And we came up with a lot of ideas, but his favorite idea was her holding the letter, this famous letter that she sent to her husband when he was in Paris, writing the Constitution, to remember the ladies.
When Abigail was writing, I think we have to think about what the ideas and ideals were at the time. The nation was being formed. This was written in March 1776, so just a few months before the Declaration of Independence. So in that Remember the Ladies, what she was asking for was more equality in economic issues. And one of the things about Abigail is that she was an investor. In that time period, women could not own property if they were married. So anything that Abigail had to do, she needed a male figure in her life. Abigail was always disappointed that she didn't have a formal education, and that was in part in Remember the Ladies. She wished she had better grammar and her penmanship were better. And yet those were things that did not keep her from writing letters. She still wrote, she still expressed her ideas and ideals.
Like most of these large-scale projects, it takes a long time to get the process rolling. It starts out with the artist's idea, and then the object, which can be made in clay, it can be made in wax, plaster. In this case for Abigail, we had an original plaster to work off of. Go to a rubber mold. Rubber mold's catching all the details from the artist. The plaster mother mold on top of the rubber keeps the form. And then once all the rubber molds are done, it moves on to wax. And so in wax, what we're doing is now we're creating another positive. So the wax is pulled from the rubbers. They're sprued, which is just a process that allows for pathways for the metal to eventually get into the piece that we're trying to cast. That goes into our ceramic shell room. We're building up a layer of anywhere between 3/8 of an inch to a 1/2 inch, depending on panel size. Once they're all dipped in ceramic shell, we're putting them in a kiln, firing it like ceramic. Now we have another negative mold of ceramic shell that bronze can get poured into. Once all the metal work is completed, we move on to patina, which really brings the piece to life.
The whole process is incredible. It's going to be a prominent, eye-catching piece that I just hope everyone enjoys, and I hope they understand how important she was, not only to our town and to our state, but to our country.
I think it's really very striking, and I think he would have been thrilled with it. The biggest wish that he had before he passed away was that she would be installed in Weymouth.
She represents, I think, all that we who live here think is the greatness of Weymouth. She is Weymouth's gem.